Today, it is my great pleasure to open the second day of our conference by introducing a keynote speaker, the President of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, Dr. Mary Daly. President Daly will speak on labor markets and their interactions with monetary policy for about 20 minutes. And then she will kindly agree to entertain questions and the discussions after that her initial presentations. Dr. Daly was appointed President and Chief Executive Officer of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco on October 1st, 2018. In this role, she serves on the FOMC, bringing the Fed's 12th district perspective to monetary policy discussion in Washington, D.C. She joined the bank in 1996 and previously served as Executive Vice President and Director of Research. Dr. Daly is one of the United States' foremost experts on labor market dynamics. Her research on economic inequality, wage and unemployment dynamics, increasing output through workforce development, and disability and retirement policy is frequently cited by other noted economists and researchers throughout the US and around the world. Often called the people's economist, Dr. Daly has been recognized for her efforts to make economics more accessible to the public. She has also become a strong voice for increasing diversity in the economics profession. Now, please welcome President Daly. The floor is yours.
Oops, wrong. I did it already wrong. I already made a mistake, and I've been up here for less than 10 seconds. Okay, here I am. Thank you very much for inviting me to the conference. It's actually really lovely to be here. It's my first time in New Zealand, and we came on Saturday and had an opportunity to tour about a bit. We had the double bonus of going and seeing our friends in Christchurch. They're New Zealanders originally, but moved to the States about 16 years ago and taught us to ski in Lake Tahoe. And so when we came back, they moved back about 4 years ago, and we got to see them in Christchurch. And we've already been to Arthur's Pass and to many vineyards and just had an amazing time. Overall, I can see why when I said I was going to New Zealand, everyone said, oh, that's on my bucket list. It really is a beautiful country, so thank you for having me. Of course, I'm also delighted to be here in my capacity as President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, and to help mark what I think of as the 30th anniversary of New Zealand's commitment to an explicit inflation targeting regime. As many in the conference noted yesterday, it was the first of its kind and has influence central banks around the world. But to be effective, monetary policy must continually evolve. That's why we come to conferences like this, in my opinion, so that we can think carefully about the issues that are before us. We live in a dynamic world that demands we remain humble about what we know and curious about what we might learn. New Zealand is a really great example of this. I was looking back in the history of the Reserve Bank, and you haven't been complacent in the past 30 years. You haven't stood still. Indeed, you've recently adopted an explicit dual mandate, one that requires both price stability and full employment. This is a framework we have a long history with in the United States. And this time, you might be thinking that I'm going to spend some time talking to you about the lessons about how to balance those objectives together. And I would offer that I'd like to, but the situation we face today isn't that simple. The world has changed since the United States first took the dual mandate 40 years ago, and things are really quite different. In the United States, here in New Zealand, and in countries around the world, a new and much less familiar economic environment has emerged. Now, we heard about many of those features yesterday. But let me just summarize them by saying our collective futures now include slower potential growth, lower long-term interest rates, and persistently weak inflation. And this new landscape demands we think differently about how to balance and achieve our price stability and full employment objectives. So today, I will share how I'm thinking about these issues from my seat at the San Francisco Fed. But as I've learned as a policymaker in my 1 year of being in this position, being curious about what others have to say and what they're thinking is equally important to being effective. So I've left plenty of time for Q&A, questions, and discussion at the end, because I'm looking forward to that dialogue. Before I begin, let me offer the standard disclaimer that the remarks I make today are my own and do not necessarily reflect anyone else in the Federal Reserve System. So let's get started. So to understand the new environment we face, I find it helpful to look back at the past. And here I'll use the United States as an example. So when I started working at the Federal Reserve in 1996, I learned 3 important facts. What I was told when I first got there were the deep parameters of central banking. So here they are. The first of these facts was the potential growth rate in the United States averages 3.5%. Some even offered it was a cosmological constant. Second, the real neutral rate of interest, or R star, also averages 3.5% in the United States. And third, employment and inflation are strongly and inexorably linked through the Phillips curve. So they really almost wrote these on stone tablets. These were so part of our DNA. Now fast forward to 2019, these facts, these deep parameters, they feel like a distant memory. As of June, that's why I scratched it out and put new. As of June, participants of the Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC, put longer run potential growth in the US at just 1.9%. And that's an optimistic view by many people's projections. Estimates of the long run neutral rate of interest were penciled in at just 0.5%. As for the Phillips curve, if you go around circles of almost any economist today, most of the discussion is about whether it's dead or simply gravely ill, but no one's talking about it's alive and well. And either way, the relationship between unemployment and inflation has become very difficult to spot, hard to see in the data. While the exact numbers that I'm speaking about may be different in the countries you're representing, the changes I've described are not unique to the United States. Global demographic shifts and lower productivity gains are tempering growth and reducing long-run interest rates in many countries, most countries really. And a number of central banks are finding that inflation is less responsive to labor market improvements than it has been in the past. These trends have really important implications for monetary policy. Lower R star and the zero lower bound mean we have less room to maneuver when the next downturn occurs. And the fainter signal that we're getting from the Phillips curve means we have less direct real-time feedback about how monetary policy is playing out in the economy. In other words, the jobs of central banks and central bankers have gotten harder. Now, when I lay out the backdrop I just described, I'm almost always asked the same 2 questions. First, if inflation isn't rising, can we run the economy as hot as we want without any consequence? And second, can monetary policy really affect inflation anymore? So let me tackle the hot economy question first. Despite many years of trying, and I've tried, as anyone who's really an economist has, I've been unable to find evidence of a free lunch. Actions always have consequences, and there are always trade-offs to consider. Some are immediate, and they're easy to see, and others take time to develop. So the question we're facing right now is, what are the trade-offs in the economy today? If the normal tension between unemployment and inflation has weakened, how do we know whether we've really achieved our full employment goals? So again, I'll turn to the US experience. Our current expansion passed its 10-year mark in July, and that's a US record. Unemployment has fallen from a 10% peak in October 2009 to near historic lows, just 3.7% in July. And other critical labor market indicators on our labor market dashboard have also improved, including prime age labor force participation, job finding rates, wages, and income. These improvements have been particularly notable for workers who are less advantaged, those who often struggle to find a foothold in the workforce. And recent research I've done with colleagues closely examines this. We asked this question: does running a hot economy versus just a sustained expansion provide extra benefits to these marginalized groups? Does it give them an extra boost? We found that when the unemployment rate, the measured unemployment rate, drops below what we think is its long-run sustainable level, the benefits to these marginalized groups increase. Said simply, the gains to running a hot economy, one where the unemployment rate that's measured is below what the consensus is of its long-run sustainable level, those benefits disproportionately flow to groups with less advantage. So these findings that we obtained from looking at historical data on the US economy in standard research techniques, these findings are echoed in the comments we hear when we speak to workforce development and community leaders. They tell us that the current economy in the United States has allowed many of their constituents, the people they serve, to get a second look from employers. If you think about it, this outcome is really intuitive. When labor markets are tight and firms are competing for workers, they find new ways to fill jobs. They recruit more intensively, they adjust hiring standards, and they look to a broader pool of potential employees. These conditions that I've just described, they create more opportunities for disadvantaged groups. They force employers to take a second look. And if you're a student of economic history or macroeconomics more generally, you'll know that this was Okun's original hypothesis, that a hot economy would benefit people. And we see this in the data. So all of this means that assigning too much weight to our projections of the long-run sustainable rate of unemployment, or U star, risks undershooting the labor market and what it can really deliver. Indeed, central banks in the United States and many other countries have been consistently marking down their estimates of U star as realized unemployment rates have fallen. And recent research in the United States and here at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand points to non-inflationary rates of unemployment that are even lower than current estimates of the natural rate of unemployment would imply. So that's the benefits. But as I said before, there is no such thing as a free lunch, and there are potential consequences to running a hot economy, which we also need to consider. For example, thinking still of the labor market, an overly tight labor market might encourage businesses and workers to make decisions that have negative impacts on long-run potential output. Some research in the United States has found that persistently strong economic conditions, a hot economy, can pull young workers out of school and move them into the labor market. And this is a choice that these workers are making that might undermine their future job prospects and earning potential. And anecdotal evidence that I collect when I speak to business leaders suggests that firms may be reducing investments in employee training and skill development to lower the costs of rapid employee turnover. And of course, as we heard yesterday, and is top of minds for so many of us, we also have to think about financial stability and how running the economy hot affects it. If interest rates get too low and borrowing becomes too easy, imbalances in financial markets could once again develop. In the United States, I'm closely watching the high level of corporate debt, particularly among risky firms. While I don't view current corporate indebtedness as posing an acute financial stability risk, this vulnerability could amplify impact of any shocks to the macroeconomy. So we need to stay vigilant. But for now, the latest Federal Reserve Financial Stability Report judges that the U.S. financial sector overall remains resilient. And if vulnerabilities were to increase further, there are instruments, such as the counter-cyclical capital buffer and others, that we might want to deploy before making monetary policy more restrictive. So if I put all of this together, if I net out the benefits and the costs, where do I stand about the trade-offs of running a hot economy? Well, right now, with the information we have today, I see little inflationary pressure and considerable uncertainty about the threshold for full employment. So I'm biased towards including as many workers in the expansion as possible. So let me turn now to the second question. Can monetary policy still affect inflation? And I don't know about you, but as a central banker, this is the one that gives you sort of a little bit of pause. You think that's our job. And if you look at the data, it does give you pause. Inflation rates in many countries have remained stubbornly below 2% for more than a decade. And this is despite considerable monetary policy stimulus and relatively healthy, even strong labor markets. You know, it's tempting, and you hear this, I'm sure you hear it here as well. It's tempting to think that these misses on inflation are not really meaningful, just a couple of tenths. But in our new economic environment, every tenth counts. There are many difficulties that could arise with persistent misses on our 2% goal. One of the most important benefits of inflation targeting was that it resulted in well-anchored inflation expectations. Households and firms became willing to smooth through idiosyncratic price shocks rather than incorporate them into wage and demands and longer-term contracts. And the success is what we've heralded. When we think of inflation targeting, this is one of the successes. And research shows that that success is in the data, that right now expectations, rather than past inflation and past inflation realizations, are the things that are the most determining of future inflation. But like most things, I will emphasize that expectations can cut both ways. If we consistently fall short of our inflation target, expectations will drift down. And we're already seeing signs of softening in survey and market-based measures of longer-run inflation expectations. Persistent misses on inflation will make the public more likely to incorporate these delivered outcomes into their plans. The anchor we worked so hard to achieve will move from the 2% target we talk about to the 2% or lower than 2% inflation we deliver. This is particularly worrisome to me, given the proximity of the effective lower bound. Below target inflation translates directly into less policy space to offset negative shocks when they come. In very practical terms, someone said yesterday, I'm a very practical person. I'm a very practical person. In very practical terms, if inflation expectations are a quarter point below our target when the next downturn arrives, and so are nominal interest rate, that's one less rate cut at our disposal. One less rate cut we can deploy to help achieve our dual mandate goals. So looking ahead, persistently low inflation presents a new problem for monetary policymakers. 30 years ago, central banks around the world needed to tamp down high and rising inflation. And the Reserve Bank of New Zealand responded by boldly introducing inflation targeting as a new monetary policy framework. And others, as we saw yesterday, quickly followed. These inflation targeting and flexible inflation targeting regimes played a large role in bringing down inflation and making it under control and in anchoring inflation expectations. But today, we're fighting a very different battle. We're fighting inflation from below our target. So this final figure is one that really emphasizes how dramatic the change has been. And as central bankers, we have to look at that and ask ourselves, are we powerless to respond to these new dynamics, or do we simply need new tools? Our current tool, flexible inflation targeting, is by design forgetful. It lets bygones be bygones and makes no attempt to make up for past inflation misses. This worked well when inflation shocks were tilted to the upside and we had plenty of policy space to offset unwanted increases. I've characterized that as the old world. In our new world of low inflation and low R star, this approach has clear challenges. It runs the risks of repeatedly delivering below target inflation during expansions and then leaving the economy with even less policy space when the next downturn emerges. Alternative strategies such as average inflation targeting and price level and nominal income targeting explicitly include a makeup strategy. They ensure inflation misses balance out over time. While no magic bullet, these makeup approaches recognize that we'll need to be intentional rather than opportunistic about offsetting inflation underruns. Of course, any changes in our monetary policy framework require careful and deliberate thought. The current approach has been effective in keeping inflation low and steady through good times and bad. So the bar for change should be very high. We should make it high. But the future looks different than the past. And much like 30 years ago, the world we face today requires us to consider bold action. For now, we must fully use the tools we have. And looking ahead, we must adapt our monetary policy frameworks to deliver on the mandates we've committed to: full employment and price stability. So let me conclude by saying that there's no question that the world has changed tremendously in recent years. And it is now crystal clear to all economists and to most households and policymakers that the world this is not just a reflection of the global financial crisis, it's actually something that was happening while the global financial crisis was going on. And these changes are things that we'll need to learn how to address. We're still learning. But I'm confident that we're working on strong foundations. Foundations that were started here with inflation targeting 30 years ago, and foundations that continue to grow stronger because we have conferences like these, and we continue to think about what's best policy, what's optimal policy for both monetary and fiscal. I personally look forward to figuring out the next 30 years together. So thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
So thank you very much, Dr. Daly. So now, if you have questions, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone, and then identify yourself, name and affiliation, and then ask a question. Questions? Mike.
My name is Toshitaka Sekine from the Bank of Japan. Thank you very much for your very thought-provoking speech. And I have two questions. One is regarding your makeup strategy things. That well, from the theoretical perspective point of view, that this makeup strategy has always has a problem of the time inconsistency problem, isn't it? And as a practitioner, as you mentioned, how serious you are thinking about this time inconsistency problem in designing this makeup strategy? That is one question. And the second question is, well, just echoing the Larry Summers or these kind of voices, there is some tendency in the society that we, the central bank, reach to the limit, and maybe we need to think about fiscal policy to become more active. On that score, how do you think that there is any scope to utilize fiscal policy rather than monetary policy? So thank you very much.
Okay. There's something on the overhead, so I have to step off to hear, but I'll come back to speak. So on the first question about the time inconsistency or time consistency problem, so these are challenges, there's no doubt. So these average inflation targeting, let's take that, average inflation targeting, but all of them work the same way. They only work to the extent that the public thinks that you're credible. In fact, if you run, this is the thing that's been most insightful to me by talking to my colleagues that do DSG models, the main impact you get from these strategies is that the public incorporates these strategies into their framework, and you front load all of this so that you don't have the fluctuations that you then have to offset. So if that's what you're looking for, everything rests on credibility, and it rests on being able to commit the future committees to the current committee's ideas. So when you think about this, you want the window over which you average to be the shortest possible window that generates the outcome you wish. That's how I'm thinking about it, because you can commit over maybe a 3-year horizon much more easily than over a 10-year horizon. So colleagues of mine in the San Francisco Fed, Sylvain Leduc, and some colleagues of his from the Board of Governors and the Bank of Canada, they've done a simple modeling exercise, and the paper I believe is available online, but we can send it to you otherwise, that basically shows, can you run a 3-year average inflation targeting window and still achieve the goals you want, and how much are you giving up if you take the window down from, say, 5 years. And they find that there's very little giving up, and you get about the same outcomes, because essentially, think about how the policy would work. You say you're committed to average inflation targeting, you're going to average over a 3-year window, and when you're approaching, you've got a miss on one side, the public knows that you're going to try to boost inflation up on the other side in order to offset that, and you have a better chance of achieving this 2%. So in the model, the simplified bare bones model, it works well, but I think that's the main question. And the way I've handled it so far in my own thought process is your best chance is to shorten the window length, and then it's about figuring out what the optimal window length is, balancing off those two objectives. So that's question one. Question two about fiscal policy. So, you know, I heard this yesterday, and you can go to any macroeconomic conference, microeconomic conference, basically any economist's conference, you'll hear the same thing, that the world we face is so challenging with slower growth and low R-star that we're going to need both sides of the house, fiscal and monetary, to work collectively to offset shocks to the economy. That is challenging. I would argue it's always challenging, but it's more challenging right now in many countries because we have been unfamiliar with it. Well, there's a variety of reasons, but let me offer one that is certainly something I've been thinking of. We've been unfamiliar with this for a long time, and then we had the GFC, whether it's global or great, it's the GFC. And what we still have to learn is how much of that collective response needs to persist beyond crisis mode. Because we're not looking, I'm much less worried, frankly, that we will be able to offset a very large financial crisis. That's an all hands on deck moment, and people tend to coordinate and work together. The thing that we're most likely to face, though, is a garden variety recession based on history where we're not as coordinated and where it doesn't seem as urgent, but the issues are still going to be important because of the lack of policy space that we have on the monetary policy side. So I have no easy solution to give you, but I do think that when we have conferences like these, increasingly I was really appreciative to see both fiscal and monetary on the agenda, because we are going to have to think hard as economists about how to organize our thoughts around these things and create interactions between them so that we can inform policymakers on both sides about what the consequences of lack of collaboration or inaction will be.
Hi, hello. Can you share us your thoughts on unconventional policy, so the QE that was done in the States and elsewhere? We're sitting here in New Zealand with just a 1% cash rate, and we're talking about the potential in a next recession to go into negative interest rates. I believe some of your colleagues have just put a note out about negative interest rates and that actually fueling inflation expectations to the downside. Any thoughts around how effective QE was? And how you could potentially use QE to forcefully get some fiscal policy happening?
Sure. So let's just step back and think about the toolkit generally. So in the toolkit that I think about, we have the funds rate in the United States, the interest rate, the forward guidance, and we have QE, balance sheet policies. You can have negative interest rates too, but that would be in the negative interest rate, that would be in the interest rate regime. So when I think of those three things, and let me give you the framework and then I'll talk about the details. When I think of those three things, and I've read all of the research literature, the research is still ongoing, so I don't think we know truth with a capital T, but here's how I read the evidence, that the funds rate is our most reliable tool. It's the one we've had the most experience with. It's the one where we can easily follow the transmission mechanisms, and we know it works. So the funds rate is first in the United States. Second, I'm convinced that forward guidance, from the evidence I read so far, is the second most effective tool, that if you communicate to the public credibly that you're going to leave rates lower for longer, then that has worked, and you can do that through a variety of methods. You can have time-based guidance, you can have threshold-based guidance, you can just simply communicate it. And then third, I would put the QE strategies. And that's not because I'm skeptical about whether they worked. It's because we've only really had them in a time of crisis, when markets really broke down, and then the inflood of liquidity was extraordinarily important. So the question that we don't have an answer to, in my judgment, is will they be as effective when financial markets aren't locked up? When we simply have a regular type recession or downturn that we're trying to offset, will we find that we have the same impact? The other part of this that I will offer is that, I think this broadly applies to central banks, but I know it applies to people who work in the Federal Reserve System. If you think about research, the academic research, all published research, you think about research done by folks who are central bankers versus research done by financial economists working in academic institutions, they tend to have different views when they put it all together about how effective QE was. For those of us in central banks, we believe, we read the evidence, and I'm one of those, that our QE strategies had an impact. For financial economists, they're more skeptical about whether those impacts were as large as central bankers believed. And so I don't want to try to weigh those pieces of evidence and convince you one way or another, but I do like the idea that we're humble about whether our tools were as effective, and we keep asking. So for now, when I stack rank them, I go with funds rate, forward guidance, QE, and this is why I'm so focused personally on creating hitting our inflation target, making sure we have conventional policy space available so that we only need to go to the other tools when we've run out of that policy space, but it's much less likely to occur.
Hi, John and Elaine from Rutgers University. Since the advent of inflation targeting, we've spent a lot of time working out how to measure inflation correctly, and we've improved our measurement of growth rates of output. Have we done enough to, given the last financial crisis, the labour market has changed a lot. Do we measure unemployment correctly? And is that one of the issues we're facing in terms of pursuing monetary policy, is that we just don't have a great measure of effective unemployment rate?
There was a whole band playing for you. I was really impressed. Do you carry that with you, or does it just... So that's a great question, and one I've spent a lot of time thinking about. So we've gone back and looked over history, and a most important question to ask that I ask myself is, have we ever measured the natural rate of unemployment well? And when I look back at history, I would argue that we haven't. We tend to have a rough estimate, and that's been great. It's a great guidepost. But when you get very close to it, the confidence bands around U star, however you think about it, are very wide. Now, in the past, we had the advantage of you could use a natural rate concept, which I would call one developed by demographically adjusted unemployment rates, et cetera, the matching functions for different age groups. But you could combine that with a NAIRU concept, a non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment concept, where we had a steeper Phillips curve, and you could marry those two things, and you could say, okay, we're roughly in the right direction with our U star, and if I add my NAIRU to it, I'm going to get this inflation signal, and that's going to tell me when I'm really close. So now we're in a more challenging situation, because the NAIRU the U star is as challenging to measure as it always has been. And it might even be a little more challenging, but I'm not convinced that that's completely true. I'm convinced it's always been challenging. Confidence bands have always been wide. But this NAIRU is not helping us as much as it once did because the real-time feedback coming from the standard Phillips curve relationship is just more tempered. So then what are you to do? And that's the million-dollar question, really. And so I'll offer a couple of things that we're doing in San Francisco with research, and I think other members of the FOMC, if you look at the websites of other central banks or reserve banks, you'll see similar kinds of things. You're saying, well, let's be a little bit humble about, again, this humility word comes up a lot in challenging times, but let's be a little humble about where we are on full employment, and let's use different methods. And one of the things I mentioned it briefly in my speech that I really like is going back to a concept like the NAIRU, but it's not really about accelerating inflation rates of unemployment. It's about how do you hold inflation steady. And if you're not getting up to target and holding steady, then do you really have what we consider full employment? Now, the counter to that is, well, maybe we're not measuring wage inflation or unit labor cost or other things accurately, and they're really running up. But I don't see any evidence of that. When I go out and talk to my business contacts, they're telling me that their profits are still good. Profit share in the United States is still high. The markup is still higher than his historically. And so what you're really seeing is we're trying to find the limits of full employment or the level of full employment without the many guideposts that we're used to. So to conclude, I wouldn't call this we've mismeasured unemployment as much as we don't have the typical extra hand there right when we get to full employment that allows us to know if we're there. So that's going to make our jobs harder. Right now, in the United States anyway, wage inflation is coming in at inflation plus productivity. It hasn't exceeded that. And we have inflation below target, so I don't see any signs that the inflationary rate of unemployment is where it is today.
Thank you very much. Christian Hawkesby, Reserve Bank. Firstly, thank you so much for joining us and travelling to speak to us. Really enjoyed your talk, particularly around average inflation targeting, because to some extent it reflects some thinking we have locally around a least regret analysis. Would you regret being above or below your target when you look ahead? Just on a slightly different topic, how would you respond to the critics of inflation targeting, the likes of the Borio at the BIS and others who sort of argue that, well, if you look back not over decades but over centuries, inflation's been sort of much lower than 2%. And if low inflation is being driven by supply side factors, is having inflation or core inflation at 1.5%, is it such a bad thing? Should, as central bankers, should we be so worried about it? Because in some sense, I feel like that's the toughest sort of criticism we face as central bankers.
Sure. No, that's a great, and I like that the less regret. Okay, I like the less regret. I'm going to use that. So but let's think about inflation targeting and 2%, and I said it as was a couple of tenths, a tenth here, a tenth there. I think that's a tempting way to think about the world, but then let's go back to what I think of as the first principles. So in the US anyway, there was a reason we chose to. It wasn't just out of nowhere. It was considered with measurement error on inflation, and we can't keep the measurement going with all the relative price changes and things. We can't keep that accurate to the minute. So with all of those things there, we wanted a buffer. And 3% seemed too high and 1% seemed too low, so 2% is just about right. So you've got the 2%. If you thought it was good in the first place, then I'm not satisfied by just saying, well, it's a supply shock, it's lower now. Let's go back and review. Do we no longer think 2 is the necessary buffer? And if we don't, that's one thing, but I prefer that type of argumentation or discussion to we're just missing by 5/10, what's the difference? So then why? There's 2 reasons. One is we said it was going to be 2, And we've worked really hard to deliver on the promise. And we had one of the first questions about time consistency, but the real question is about credibility. Do you have a credible central bank? And if you say it's going to be 2 and it's really 1.5, then 1.5 will be what people incorporate, and it's really not 2 at all. And so these are important things about our credibility that I would like us to be more serious about than to just say, well, a 10th here, a 10th there. The second thing is the policy space argument I made. So in this environment, it's not just 5/10 on inflation, and so how big of a deal that is, that's 5/10 on the policy rate. If nominal interest rates are following inflation plus the neutral rate of interest, that's 2 rate cuts, not just 1 in the example I gave. So we want to, I'm going to argue that we should be very thoughtful about what we're willing to take as the right target. I personally am still, based on the evidence, focused on 2%, and that's historically delivered the results we want. And I would be hard-pressed to move away from that 2%, and I'm not at all comforted by it's just a couple of tenths. So let me conclude by talking about supply shocks. So that's a really important question. You can decompose inflation into cyclical inflation versus acyclical inflation. In the US, if my memory serves, cyclical inflation makes up about 40% of total movements in inflation, and acyclical is about 60%. So we are having this pressure from acyclical inflation that's downside. In the 70s, it was on the upside. Healthcare in the United States was growing, inflation was rising, and it was pushing inflation up, and the cyclical part was what we were using to get it down. We felt very comfortable fighting that type of an increase, a cyclical increase, and I would ask or argue that we should be equally focused on fighting on the other side.
Marzuni Sham, Central Bank of Malaysia. Thank you, Dr. Daly. I just have a question in terms of the interaction between monetary policy and financial stability. You mentioned briefly in your remarks about the resilience of the financial sector in the US, but you mentioned that if anything, I mean, if the vulnerabilities emerge or something, then the response would be on macroprudential counter-cyclical capital buffers. But you did also mention that monetary policy could also be considered. So I'm just wondering under what circumstances that monetary policy would be considered to address issues in financial stability. Thank you.
So let me get up a little bit to a framework as opposed to a specific set of matrices about when you would pull what lever. So in the framework that I use, it's a constrained optimization. We talked about this yesterday. It's just a constrained optimization problem. We have a dual mandate in the United States given by Congress, full employment and price stability, and we're solving those goals, we're meeting those objectives subject to the constraint that we don't create asset bubbles and other things that then end up plummeting the economy into a difficult period, because ultimately the mandated goals are the methods we use to achieve the overarching goal, which is to promote sustainable and healthy economy. So that's how I think of it. And then that's why I looked at those 3 things together. I look at, okay, what's going on in the labor market? Do we see any signs of imbalances emerging in the labor market that we want to offset and say we've got allocative inefficiencies forming or something, so we need to slow down the economy? Then we look at the inflation rate. Are we rising above our target? Are we projected to rise above our target and achieve, or create unsustainably high inflation? No. And then the final picture I gave was, well, what's going on with financial stability? And when you look at the financial stability report, which we do every quarter, at least in the U.S., you see that overall the financial system remains resilient, even though there are pockets of concern that we're carefully looking at. So that's how I do it. And then when you ask why did I offer these other tools, the reason I offer the other tools is that monetary policy is a very blunt instrument for financial stability concerns. We are working with we have 2 goals in many countries and 1 instrument. And now you're adding a 3rd potential goal where the instrument's even blunter. These are just challenges that are hard to manage. So when you think about rank ordering your tools, there are other more targeted tools for financial stability that I argue we should think about before we deploy a blunter tool to solve a problem. So that's how I think about it, and it's really balancing these two objectives, the dual mandate, in a constrained optimization problem where you also have to think about financial stability. But that's why we have a committee structure, I'd argue too, that if you're left to a particular model, a particular set of historical data, or a particular point of view, you run the risk of not having a complete optimal policy. So, I have this view, which I'm sure most of you hold, that a committee structure or a discussion where reasonable people can disagree and we all talk about these issues, that's our best chance of creating the best policy. You've heard me say humble more than once. I have this mantra that when I became a policymaker, I use all the time. It is true, I just use it all the time. You can ask my team. I say we need to be curious, confident, and humble. And what that looks like is all of us are constantly curious about what's the best tool, how do we think about things, confident when we take the decision, because being underconfident in taking the decision doesn't help anyone, but then humble the day after we take the decision, or maybe the minute, about what we might have missed, and we start the curiosity again. So that's a mantra I'm living by, and I try to do it collectively, and that helps, I think, in making the best policy.
Well, we still have plenty of time for questions, so don't be shy.
Just wondered if you had any comments on your growth and interest rate accounting that you showed at the start. So originally it was 3.5 GDP growth, I suppose sort of medium-term steady state, and the 3.5 neutral rate. Now they differ. I think it was 1.9 and 0.5. Anything to explain why they are different? Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. So I no longer have the chart, but I can, you summarized it nicely. So the question really is, why did we go from something in the 3.5 range to something in the 2 range, 2% growth? Let's just take potential growth. When you do the calculations of this, it's really about, oh, thank you, perfect. My friends in the back have helped me. Go one more? Okay. There you go. Okay, perfect. So the reason is largely associated with demographic changes. So if you think about the United States, but this is true in all industrialized nations, and some more than even in the United States. If you think about G-star of 3.5, a good fraction of that was labor force growth. At its peak, it was growing over 2% per year, the labor force, as we had the baby boom come in. So now the baby boom's retiring, the subsequent birth cohorts are smaller, and we just don't have that push. So our labor force is growing at 0.5%. In the United States. So we go from 2 or over 2 to 0.5. That's already taking, 1.5 percentage points off of growth, right off the top. So then you go and say, well, what's the rest of it? Well, when you can do this productivity growth calculation a variety of ways. Let's just take the range of things that I consult. So the first is what I call the bottom-up accounting. John Fernald is well known for this in the United States. So this bottom-up accounting says that projected productivity growth is going to be about 1%, trend productivity growth 1%, maybe 1.2%. And that plus 0.5 on labor force growth is 1.7 on G-star. Now, some have argued, well, that's very pessimistic. So now let's take and put in historical productivity growth rates, not this bottom-up accounting, but let's take out the rapid productivity gains in the United States anyway of the 1990s, that productivity boom, which if you drew a chart was a trend break for a short period of time relative to all of history. So if you put in the historical average growth rate on productivity, with that, absent that high period, you'd get something like 2% GDP growth. Potential GDP growth. So even when you say, well, you shouldn't be as pessimistic as 1% or 1.2%, and you put in something a little bit higher, you're still, if you have 1.5% productivity growth and 0.5% labor force growth, that's 2% GDP growth. So it's extremely difficult to get this boosted back up to 3.5%. And our star is facing the same downward pressures from demographic changes. We have an aging population globally. Those individuals are holding onto their savings and they're saving more. They put downward pressure on the neutral rate of interest. And birth cohorts coming after them are smaller, desiring less investment. So there's all of these types of things that just make the neutral rate of interest have downward pressure. And that's why, let me just say one more thing about it. That's why there were certainly some cyclical headwinds pressing down on our star. But if you look at if you get through the cyclical headwinds, the estimates coming out are more structurally based factors, global demographic trends, savings versus investment, and of course, labor force growth in all countries is slowing because of the population trends.
Hi, Stephen Topoulos from the BNZ. I like your idea of being curious, confident and humble. In my experience, there's a lot of central bankers who have got the confident bit right, and the other two go missing. So I was very happy to hear that. Just, I guess, one thing I can't get my head around is, you said at the beginning that we have to accept that we're in a world of lower potential growth, we're in a world of lower interest rates, and we're in a world of persistently weak inflation. And I accept all of those things. You then go on to describe the fact that up there, potential growth rates revised down from 3.5 to 1.9, without getting too cute about exactly where they are. Real neutral interest rates going from 3.5 to 0.5. Nauru has fallen, arguably whatever number, but it's fallen probably quite a lot. And we're sort of willing to revise what we thought were cast in concrete assumptions on all of those variables, but we're not willing to shift our view on where inflation should be. We've gone from 2 to 2. And it seems to me that there still needs to be more discussion on where that could have moved to in a new steady state, given all of those other factors.
No, I completely agree with you, but I would separate the 2 points about inflation into 2 separate buckets. So one is we can document, and I think many have documented, the downward pressure on inflation coming from a variety of things, mostly on the supply side. These structural factors just pushing down inflation globally. So that's a fact, and we have to live with that fact. But inflation is a targeted variable which we choose. We can choose the rate at which we target. And the question is then separate in my mind from what the data are doing what the trends are doing to inflation. It's a question about, do we think that 2% is the right buffer? If we don't think that 2% is the right buffer, then we can accept inflation that's lower. But if we think that there are a combination of factors pushing inflation down, structural factors, but we still think 2% is the right buffer for all the reasons I talked about both in the speech and in the previous questions, then we have to work to push inflation up leaning against those structural downward pressures. I think that's the discussion we should be having, absolutely. But I don't see. Let me put it this way. I don't want us to leave the debate by saying, well, structural factors are pushing it down, so there's nothing we can do about it. We should accept 1.5. Nor do I want us to hang, almost religiously, fervently on to 2 without a review of whether 2 is the buffer. I've made a case for why I think 2 is a good buffer because of the policy space, but that's something that should be a subject of conferences. The hard thing is it's considered very measurement issues about inflation, but really it's an idea of what can you live with in terms of a buffer. And when I look at Japan, I get a little worried about allowing inflation to drift to 1.5 and being okay with that, because when I went back and I did this just as an exercise for myself, since I wasn't paying attention carefully during that time. You go back into the 1990s when inflation in Japan was first starting to slip, and many of the members of the central bank were saying we shouldn't worry about it. It's a 10th here, it's a 10th there. And so they weren't saying that literally, but that's kind of the basics. And I just think we should learn from that experience that at least a studious approach to this, really asking what's the right buffer, is appropriate.
Yes, we have time for one more question.
Can I take two because there's a woman in the back as well?
Well, we have a coffee break.
Oh, is it? I'm sorry. So okay, I misread my watch. Sorry about that.
Talking about the buffer, I feel 2 or 3 more questions.
Thank you. Hi, Rebecca Williams from the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. At the start, you were introduced as the people's economist, which is great. And I was wondering how you explain this abstract concept of full employment to the general public, especially when you hopefully one day are in a situation where you need to tighten interest rates. Thank you.
So we explain it this way, and it's in, we have a handbook that we pass out when people come to work at the Reserve Bank in San Francisco, Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, and it says that we have 2 mandates. Everyone who wants a job can get one, and the dollar in your pocket holds its value. So those are very simplistic manifestations of our mandate. But when you think of full employment, it's that everyone who wants a job can get one is something I take very seriously. And you might ask me immediately, I mean, I would, well, wait a minute, Mary, if you have a cyclical economy, some people don't have the right skills for jobs that are available today. So in the Reserve Bank of San Francisco, but also in the system more generally, you can find many examples of this. We're thinking more and more about full employment today, which is a cyclical phenomena, and you can employ as many workers who want a job and have the right skill set to enter in. But we also want to think about full employment tomorrow. Part of our mandate is full employment tomorrow. So one of our obligations or responsibilities that I take seriously is to think about carefully, do research on, and discuss how do we enable a workforce that will be prepared to take on the jobs of our future. So that's how I describe full employment to the average person in my district or in the United States more generally. And I think it's a commitment we should hold ourselves to.
Thank you very much for your value presentation. And I'm here, I want to give one comment to your presentation and one question for you about the objectives of the monetary policy. I think the conflict between inflation and growth and the multi-objectives are the problem of many central banks, especially the State Bank of Vietnam. In the law of the State Bank of Vietnam, we have to pursue the price stability, but we also have to follow the objective of economic growth and financial stability. So that is the headache of our colleagues. But we do, I think we do well during the past 10 years. We can put the high inflation from more than 20% to around 4% now, and we don't have any problem with the price stability objective. I think in the future, maybe we'll think about other tools to get the economic growth and employment. And one question, I think for economic growth and employment, you said that there is less room for monetary policy as liquidity trap or zero interest rate or something like that. And you said that the fiscal policy may be another tool. But what do you think about the coordination between macroeconomic policy as well? For example, monetary policy, fiscal policy, and I think trade policy, as well as investment policy. What do you think about the coordination between these all macroeconomic policies?
So I'm going to divide it the way that we divide it in the United States, which is the fiscal side of our house. I mean, that's how I think about it. That side deals with regulation, trade policy, fiscal stimulus, spending, all of the things that you named that were on that side. And at different periods in our history, those have been coordinated on a strategic coordination, and sometimes they're not as coordinated, but it's all part of the fiscal side of the house. As a monetary policymaker, we react to the economy we're given. And at different points in history, that economy is shaped by different things. Sometimes it's exogenous shocks from other nations and the economies of the global growth. It's sometimes about the situation in our own country. But either way, we're simply responding to the economy we're given, and that's what monetary policy does. But to the question that started the Q&A session, going forward, monetary and fiscal authorities will have to work harder to find ways to think about problems as not as a coordinated strategy necessarily, because that implies a lot of different things that I think tear at independence and other things which I don't believe in, but thoughtfully approaching the problems we face as a group, as a team. And that's where economists are going to have to be helpful. Because even in our own models, the bulk of the literature that I've read takes the fiscal as an exogenous entity and figures out what monetary will do, or vice versa. And so the papers that put them together are really very helpful to us going forward. And that's where we will need to have many future conferences, in my opinion. Thank you. Oh, you have a question. I'm sorry. You had me on a rule, so I was.
Let me abuse my privilege as a moderator. You mentioned that the full employment of tomorrow is a pertinent concern for the central bankers. But how about the full employment for 5 years, 10 years down the road? We've seen that in the United States, perhaps robotics has affected the blue-collar workers first, so the Rust Belt is there. And now San Francisco is safe for now. But then AI may come to the white-collar workers, right? And then what is the future? Well, I couldn't resist that. I understand this is a central banking seminar, but since you're a great labor market specialist, I would like to, pick your brains about this. What you see about the future of work, future of jobs, and its implications.
Okay. So I am a student of history, largely because history gives me comfort. So I remember taking my first undergraduate economics class, and it was about the evolution of economics and the Industrial Revolution. And the very first group I learned about was the Luddites, who were very against the Industrial Revolution because they were convinced, among many things, that we were going to have no jobs for people to do, and we'd be replaced by machines. And if you look at some of the early drawings that went with the Luddites campaign, they were about machines, and people were on the sides doing nothing and growing poorer and poorer. And we know how that turned out. And so what I want to caution us, and I caution all of people about, is we can't be pessimistic about what our future holds because we see the current situation changing. But change is hard. Transformation is difficult. And in the times when that transformation occurs, there are people who get pushed aside or left out. And it is part, and this is what I meant by full employment for tomorrow, it's part of the obligation of the economics profession and policymakers generally, I think, to identify where these skill mismatches occur and what the skills of the future will be. And then it's, of course, the obligation of policymakers on the fiscal side of the house to assist in getting people the opportunities to get the skills they need. So it's a joint equation where individuals have to say the world before me is changing, and policymakers, as part of the social contract, can think about how do we best mobilize our workforces. I see this happening in many parts of the world, and even in the United States, in different states, where groups are recognizing that you need to mobilize it, or activate, I think is the word that gets used in Europe quite a bit, activate your labor force by getting the training to match the future. But I'm not worried today that robots will take us over, because I sat in San Francisco Fed, 1996, never heard of a company named Facebook, barely heard of anything about Google or Alphabet, and those are two of the biggest employers in our area. So it's very tempting to not imagine a future where there are jobs made by other groups and only think about the losses, but that's not how it's ever worked.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So this concludes this very nice session 5. Please join me thanking Dr. Daly for the great presentation. Now we have until 10:45 for coffee break and reconvene at 10:45. Thank you.